What's the most disturbing part of the Bible? The destruction of the Amalekites? Yeah, that's pretty rough. What about this bit in Ephesians? Yeah, slaves be obedient, that's not aged super well. And then of course there's the verse where they call my pal the screech owl an abomination. But how about the binding of Isaac? I'm sure you all know the story. God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. They go up the mountain, Abraham lifts the knife, it probably catches the light dramatically. Then God swoops in at the 11th hour and reveals...
It was a test!
They kill a very unlucky sheep that's just wandering by minding its own business, and go home. By now you're probably thinking, most disturbing, really? And maybe you're right. While it was a close call and it's hard to find a great moral here, this episode is positively tame compared to what happens elsewhere in the Old Testament. But what if I told you this tale harbours a dark secret? What if there was another version of the story with a less cheerful ending? An older version that was considered so despicable by later followers of the faith that it was buried forever. A version of the binding of Isaac when no one showed up to stay Abraham's hand. To answer this question, we first have to ask another. Who wrote the Bible? Or actually, who wrote this bit of the Bible? The first 5 books of the Old Testament, known as the Pentateuch, or Jewish Torah. Traditionally, the Pentateuch is believed to have been penned by Moses, over 1,000 years before Christ. But A, that's never actually claimed within the text itself, and B, this bit probably wasn't written by him. I mean, maybe God just told Moses to write down the story of his own death, but it would have been a rough conversation. Biblical scholars have long pointed out all kinds of contradictions in the Pentateuch that make it seem unlikely it all came from a single author. For instance, is the mountain where Moses receives the 10 Commandments called Horeb or Sinai? Is Moses' father-in-law called Reuel, Jethro, or Hobab? Of course, places and people can have multiple names, but that's just where the evidence begins. These books are also full of doublets and triplets, passages where the same event happens multiple times, as if several authors were retelling the same story over and over. For instance, Jacob's name is changed to Israel here in Genesis 32, where he wrestles with a man who is probably God or an angel and is blessed by him. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. But then 3 chapters later in Genesis 35, God blesses Jacob again and says, Your name is Jacob. No longer shall you be called Jacob, Israel shall be your name. Sometimes you get doublets that don't just repeat a previous passage, but actually contradict what came before, like in the story of Noah's Ark. In most versions of this tale, Noah and his sons gather 2 of every animal for their cruise, and that's what it says here in Genesis chapter 7 verse 9. The animals go in 2 by 2, hurrah hurrah. But actually, just a passage or 2 above this, God commands Noah to take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean. Why does the ark need so many pure animals? Well, it's because when the waters recede and Noah reaches dry land, he sacrifices a bunch of them, and God smells how good his sacrifice is and promises not to drown the earth again. But if we look again at the other passage more closely, it specifically states that both clean and unclean animals came in 2s, almost as if someone was trying to correct the record. And in Genesis 6, God commands Noah, Of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark. It makes no distinction at all between clean and unclean animals. You can find ways to justify the quirks of the Pentateuch and make it work as a single complete text, but most scholars now think it makes more sense when viewed as a patchwork. This also helps explain why there are 2 separate versions of the creation myth in Genesis 1 and 2, and why there are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments. Oh yeah, that's right, Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20 has the version we all know, but Exodus 34 has a very different set of 10 rules, explicitly referred to as the 10 Commandments, that are far more focused on specific rituals, such as Passover, sacrificing the first babies of your livestock to God, put a pin in that one, we're coming back to it, and not boiling a baby goat in its mother's milk. So if multiple people wrote the Pentateuch, then who were they? Well, the most popular theory, the documentary hypothesis, identifies 4 sources, and these can be spotted thanks to the different language and phrases they use, and especially the way they refer to God. The oldest source is J, the Yahweh source. It's called that because it refers to God by his personal name Yahweh, translated in English versions as Lord with this weird capitalization going on. This source features God at his most anthropomorphic. In J, God is seen walking through the Garden of Eden, breathing life into Adam's nostrils, smelling Noah's sacrifice, and generally acting a bit like a person. Next is E, the Elohist source, so named because it repeatedly uses Elohim, which is usually just translated to God. Whereas J is interested in the southern kingdom of Judah, E is more focused on the northern kingdom of Israel. Scholars think it could come from the perspective of the Israeli refugees, who came to Judah after Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in 720 BC. P is the priestly source, and it's the newest version, probably written during Persian rule in the 6th or 5th century BC. It features the most transcendent God, more likely to exercise power with his voice than get his hands dirty. Finally, D is the Deuteronomist source. Basically, the book of Deuteronomy is its own separate thing, not really interwoven with the others. So for the sake of this video's runtime, we can immediately stop talking about it. For much of the 20th century, the documentary hypothesis was the consensus, until academics, who stop having things to write about when everyone agrees, came up with a bunch of different ways the text can be split between different authors. But for simplicity's sake, we're sticking with this version. We've got places to be, human sacrifices to talk about. Okay, so now we can return to the story of Isaac and Abraham, with this idea that the text might draw from different sources. And it quite clearly does. The story starts off with the E source, referring to Elohim or God, but the E account ends at verse 10, right on the cliffhanger. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. In verse 11 we have, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.'" Stop that right now. That's Lord as in Yahweh, so this is an interjection by the J source. E then picks up the story again at verse 19 with this, "Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba." So, Abraham's headed home, but where is Isaac? Notice that on the way there, Abraham took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. Then once they leave the other men behind, the 2 of them walked on together. It repeats that twice. The 2 of them walked on together. And then afterwards, Abraham returned to his young men. Isaac never appears again in the E source. Do I need to spell out the obvious conclusion here? In the E version of this story, Abraham really did sacrifice his son to God. But okay, even if child sacrifice is what happened in one lost version of this well-known biblical story, that doesn't mean people actually did it, right? Well, there's no strong archaeological evidence of child sacrifice being practiced in the region, if that's what you're asking. So if you want to believe it was always metaphorical, that's fine. But there is plenty more textual evidence to support the idea that some early Israelites did in fact sacrifice their children to God. Let's return to that weird alternate version of the Ten Commandments, or to give it its proper title, the Ritual Decalogue, that I flashed up on the screen earlier. Because there's an earlier version of this rule from Exodus 22, and it looks like this. "The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me." A worrying passage, isn't it? Some argue that this means giving the child into temple service, but this really doesn't work for multiple reasons. Firstly, it says to do the same thing with your oxen, who don't typically make for great priests. And secondly, what would be the point of taking babies from their mothers and giving them to the priesthood at 8 days old? Are these temples or daycares? The idea seems to be that because Yahweh passed over them and didn't kill their children in the 10th plague during Exodus, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to him, whether human or animal. But thankfully, when this rule appears in Exodus 34's Ritual Decalogue, we get this. "Redeem the firstborn donkey with a lamb. Redeem all your firstborn sons." There's still the suggestion that God is owed something, but now you can give a lamb in the place of an unclean donkey, and in the place of a human child. In Numbers this appears again, but now the price of redemption is not the lamb's blood, but 5 shekels. And in the book of Samuel, it talks about firstborns being given into temple service. Hopefully once they're up walking and talking. But why have this practice of redeeming at all? Why not just not mention anything about sacrificing babies? Might there once have been this tradition of actually giving your firstborn child to God, which then was replaced with a representation of the act? This would perfectly explain the addition of the J passage to the binding of Isaac, which can then sort of be seen as an example of how this redemption is to be done. And in fact, the Ritual Decalogue is associated with J, whereas the passage without redemption is associated with the more sacrifice-happy E, so this would appear to fit very neatly. Grim as it sounds, in a period where infant mortality rates may have been as high as 50%, and the firstborn children of very young mothers would have had even lower odds of survival, giving up one child to secure success for the others may have had a certain brutal logic. And I don't mean that in the fewer mouths to feed sense that causes coots and moorhens to attack their own young. The reason you'd sacrifice a child is the same reason why you'd sacrifice your livestock or part of your harvest. The idea is you're getting God's blessing in return and allowing what remains to prosper. So for instance, in the binding of Isaac, Abraham is told that he will have lots of children because he was willing to sacrifice his son. Since this rule appears multiple times in the Bible, and because different ways of redeeming your child exist, it seems there was a widespread belief that your first child was owed to God in some way. And, a little paradoxically, the fact that human sacrifice is repeatedly condemned in different ways throughout the Old Testament can be seen as a strong indication that some Israelites were actually going through with it. You don't have to forbid something that no one wants to do. This sort of tithing of firstborn children is not the only type of child sacrifice that appears in the Bible, though it's definitely the main one that could be connected to the Hebrews. The second book of Kings, for instance, describes a war between Israel and Moab. It's going badly for the Moabites, who are locked in their fortified city, slingers plinking away at the walls. Then in desperation, the king of Moab sacrifices his firstborn son, burning him on the wall, presumably to the Moabite god Chemosh. The result of this is that a great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. We can't assume that just because this neighbouring kingdom did this sort of crisis sacrifice as an emergency measure, that the Israelites had the same practice, but it's shocking that the sacrifice to try and bring about divine intervention, and from a god that is not even Yahweh I should add, seems here to have worked. What can we make of that? And then finally we have the puzzle of Moloch or Molech. Traditionally, Moloch is depicted as essentially an evil enemy god, a hungry, blood-soaked, sacrifice-demanding deity of the Canaanites, reimagined in Milton's Paradise Lost as a child-eating demon serving Satan. Various Bible verses imply that there once was some sort of Israelite practice of burning children to Moloch at something called a Tophet in the valley of Hinnom or Gehenna, and the Bible makes it clear that anyone who gives their offspring to Moloch will be put to death. 2 Kings has the most explicit mention of Molech, and keeps the traditional view of Tophet as a location synonymous with hell rather than a sacred site, and Moloch as some sort of false god. This was the way the terms were interpreted by the first ancient Greek translators. He defiled Tophet, which is in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one would make a son or daughter pass through their fire as an offering to Molech. But other evidence now seems to suggest that Moloch was the name not for a god, but for the sacrificial practice itself. Loads of contemporary classical texts state that human sacrifice, involving burning children in a pit of fire or oven, was practiced in the Punic colonies by the Carthaginians, both to the Roman god Saturn and their own gods like Tanit and Baal Hamon. And in the 1920s, archaeological evidence was found to back that up. It's usually quite hard to determine from remains if a sacrifice took place, or if someone just died of other causes, but in the Carthage Tophet site, you've got urns full of animal and human bones, in a religious location, with steely stone slabs that describe sacrifices. It seems like here, children or animals were promised as a vow, and then sacrificed to give thanks for a god's help in some private endeavour. At this site, inscriptions describe a mulk mur or promise of a lamb to Saturn. It seems that here, under Roman influence, the original Carthaginian practice of human sacrifice was eventually swapped out for an animal offering. The inscriptions include the names of children and express gratitude to Saturn for taking this alternative gift. Historians have then linked this to other Carthaginian carvings with the term mulk dum, which can be translated as the promise of a human. There are even a few steles that depict priests holding infants, in case there was still any doubt about exactly what was going on here. Many scholars think that these Carthaginian mulk rituals and the Moloch described in the Bible are the same thing. But how could this practice have made it to the Israelites? Well, through mainland Phoenicia, of course, which bordered the kingdom of Israel. However, while we have loads of evidence of human sacrifice taking place in the Punic colonies of North Africa, there's virtually none for mainland Phoenicia, where they came from. But child sacrifice doesn't seem like the sort of thing you just start up on a whim, so it isn't an enormous stretch to guess that the Carthaginians inherited this Moloch practice from their homeland, even if there's a gap there in the archaeological record. So, unlike other forms of sacrifice, this was a foreign practice, and the Bible firmly condemns it. In 2 Kings 16, the evil king of Judah, Ahaz, who is clearly shown to be influenced by foreign traditions, as he redecorates the Jerusalem temple in the style of the temple at Damascus, engages in Moloch. He even made his son pass through fire, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord had driven out before the people of Israel. but there's no reason to assume that he was serving foreign gods. In fact, the way Moloch is forbidden is very telling. Essentially it's, don't worship your god in the way the people whose land you've taken serve theirs, like burning your sons and daughters. It suggests the writer was specifically worried about sacrifices to Yahweh. Likewise, in Leviticus 18, the warning is not to profane the name of God by sacrificing any of your offspring to Moloch. It's hard to see how God's name would be profaned by a sacrifice to someone else. The ritual surely must have been done in the name of Yahweh. So we've got two seemingly separate forms of child sacrifice, one foreign, one perhaps with deep roots in the Yahweh's tradition. But exactly when these rituals took place and how common they were, we'll probably never know. What happened next seems self-explanatory though. The Israelites decided child sacrifice was a no-no, and the Bible both tries to stamp it out and distance it from the Hebrew religion. So that's why there's warnings against performing sacrifices in Yahweh's name, but also claims that child sacrifice was something God never wanted, and that any human sacrifice that was done must have been done to another god, Baal. And really interestingly, at one point in the book of Ezekiel, the offering up of the firstborn child is directly and explicitly acknowledged as something God did command, but it's suggested that these were statues that were not good, and that Yahweh deliberately gave the rebellious Israelites bad rules as a punishment. The Bible generally links sacrificial rituals with foreign deities and idolatry, which may have started out as a way of trying to stop it, and then later, once the practice did die out, given weight to the theory that it was never something connected with Yahweh in the first place. The ritual of redeeming the firstborn through animal sacrifice became the only accepted practice, and then it became the way things had always been done. The horrors of a previous age were slowly forgotten. But hey, that's just a theory. Historians like John Levinson argue that despite the practice of sacrificing a firstborn child or beloved son dying off, the idea stuck around as a symbol many centuries later. Although saying that, it's hard to see how this symbolic idea of sacrifice really manifested anywhere. The notion of sacrifice isn't really that important outside of the passages we've looked at in the Old Testament. It's not like there's this sacrifice where a human being is associated with a sacrificial lamb, a moment where a father gives up his son for some all-important purpose. So, I don't think, oh hey, what are you doing here, Jesus? Thank you for watching my attempt here to confuse the YouTube algorithm. We'll be back to the evolution stuff in the next video. In fact, I think I might do something on dinosaurs next, so stay tuned for that. But I do want to keep this channel as varied as I can for as long as I can. So if you enjoyed this, please leave a like to let me know, share it around, just give it all the love you can. It'll really help. My main source for this video has been Heath Durrell's Child Sacrifice in Ancient Israel, which is a great and surprisingly readable book. Check it out if you get the chance. Okay, bye.